The quiet neighborhood of Maple Crest had always carried an illusion of peace, freshly trimmed lawns, polished driveways, matching mailboxes, and a board of homeowners who believed they were guardians of perfection. For years, the HOA maintained control like a silent monarchy, and most residents accepted it without question. But everything began to shift the day they decided that one homeowner, me, was no longer welcome within their precious boundaries. It all started with small complaints, the kind people normally ignore because they seem too petty to matter. A garden hose left outside for too long, a trash bin placed at the curb 5 minutes early, a porch light bulb that flickered before being replaced. Each notice arrived in a white envelope stamped with the HOA's official crest, and each one felt increasingly personal. At first I brushed them off as typical oversight, assuming the board had nothing better to do than micromanage harmless details. But the tone in those letters slowly changed, transforming from polite reminders to formal warnings, as if I were secretly committing crimes against the neighborhood aesthetic. Soon the warnings turned into fines, seemingly for anything they could think of. A small crack in the driveway counted as a hazard. A planter on my front steps was suddenly unauthorized decor. Even the color of my newly painted shutters, perfectly neutral and within the guidelines, was judged as visually disruptive. It became obvious that someone on the board, or perhaps the entire board, was targeting me. The harassment escalated so precisely and consistently that it couldn't have been random. And while most homeowners whispered about the HOA's strictness, no one dared to challenge the board directly, because the president, Mr. Alden, had a reputation for punishing those who questioned his authority. Alden carried himself like a self-appointed ruler, always walking around with a clipboard, sunglasses, and a faint smirk that suggested he enjoyed enforcing rules more than actually maintaining the neighborhood. Under his leadership, the HOA shifted from protectors of the community to watchdogs of every movement. Behind closed doors, everyone disliked him, but no one ever crossed him. Those who tried mysteriously ended up facing violations, fees, or long-delayed approvals for even the simplest requests. One autumn afternoon, I received a final notice that jolted me harder than any previous letter. It claimed that I had repeatedly violated community standards, and due to my continued disregard, the board would be initiating action to remove me from the neighborhood. The phrasing was cold, mechanical, and confident, as though they had already decided the outcome and expected no resistance. The letter stated that I had 30 days to vacate the property or face legal escalation. For a moment, everything froze. The house I had worked years to afford, the quiet street I'd grown familiar with, the memories I had built within these walls, suddenly they all seemed fragile, as if they could be erased by a single signature from a group of biased board members. Anger simmered beneath the fear, but I knew reacting impulsively would play directly into their hands. I needed to understand why they were so desperate to remove me, and more importantly, what they were hiding. I began observing the neighborhood differently, paying attention to conversations, noticing who avoided eye contact, watching which houses received warnings and which ones didn't. Patterns started to emerge. Certain board members seemed unusually protective of Alden, covering for him whenever issues were raised. Neighbors who once greeted me warmly now seemed nervous, offering polite smiles that carried the silent message, "Be careful." Some even slipped hints that things within the HOA weren't what they seemed, but always stopped themselves before saying too much. That was my first clue that something bigger was happening. A week later, while walking my dog early in the morning, I noticed Alden sneaking around the side of a vacant property the HOA had supposedly been renovating. His truck was parked far from sight, and instead of wearing his usual HOA badge, he moved cautiously, checking over his shoulder every few seconds. It was the first time I had ever seen him without his authoritative swagger. He looked nervous. Almost guilty. Curiosity mixed with suspicion as I kept my distance, pretending to walk casually, but quietly observing him. He unlocked the side door of the vacant house and slipped inside with a small black bag. Something wasn't right. If this was official work, why was he hiding it? Why was he alone? And why so early, before anyone else was awake? Over the next few days, similar sightings occurred. I spotted him entering different properties, some vacant, some belonging to homeowners who were rarely home. He always chose odd hours, always entered discreetly, and always left quickly, locking the doors behind him like nothing had happened. It became impossible to believe these were normal HOA duties. Whatever he was doing, it was something he didn't want the community to witness. Meanwhile, the pressure from the HOA intensified. They increased fines. They threatened to cut off access to community amenities. They mailed letters claiming I had failed to respond to previous notices, even though I had proof I had replied. Everything they could weaponize, they used. It felt like a coordinated effort to push me out before I could uncover whatever Alden was hiding. But the turning point came when a neighbor, a quiet and anxious man who usually kept to himself, knocked on my door one evening. His hands trembled as he slipped me a flash drive and whispered that I might need this. He didn't stay long, refusing to explain anything, but the fear in his eyes made it clear that he was risking something by giving it to me. The moment he left, I felt a chill crawl up my spine, knowing this small device might change everything. When I plugged the flash drive into my computer, dozens of files appeared. Photos, videos, scanned documents, each one revealing pieces of a puzzle that the HOA had carefully buried. And at the center of every suspicious transaction, every forged form, every unauthorized expense, stood the HOA president himself. This was the moment I realized the truth. They wanted me gone because I had gotten too close. They thought evicting me would silence me. But they didn't know what I now had in my hands. I stared at the screen as it all sank in, knowing that the next move I made would decide everything, my home, the neighborhood's future, and whether Alden's secret would finally be exposed. And that's where the real story begins. The night after discovering the files on the flash drive felt heavier than any night I had ever endured in that house. The walls, once comforting, now echoed with the weight of a truth too dangerous to ignore. Sleep refused to come. My mind replayed the hidden transactions, falsified signatures, and camera footage revealing Alden entering homes that weren't his. Every file pointed to a pattern, one that exposed not just misconduct, but a web of control woven through fear and manipulation. The HOA had not targeted me because I broke rules. They targeted me because I was the only one who had started noticing the cracks in their perfect facade. And the person standing at the center, pulling the threads, was the president himself. By morning, the neighborhood felt different. The crisp, manicured lawns looked artificial, almost staged, now that I knew how the HOA maintained order. Even the quiet air seemed tense, as if the houses themselves were holding secrets. The people I passed on my walk seemed guarded, eyes shifting away quickly, shoulders tight. It wasn't paranoia, something in Maple Crest had always been off, and now I finally understood why. I spent most of the day reviewing the files one by one, organizing them, trying to piece together a timeline. There were emails showing Alden approving maintenance expenses that didn't exist, invoices from companies he secretly owned, and property upgrades that the HOA supposedly funded but which never happened. There were also pictures, grainy, time-stamped images from inside vacant homes. In some he carried tools, in others equipment boxes, and in one he walked out with a small lockbox that didn't belong to him. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became, Alden had been using his position to siphon money, stage false repairs, and quietly access certain houses. The HOA was not a strict board, it was a shield he used to protect his personal schemes. And anyone who got too close, was pushed out. By early afternoon, I realized the next step wasn't collecting proof, it was surviving long enough to use it. Because it didn't take long for the HOA to sense something had shifted. A black SUV with the HOA logo idled near my driveway longer than necessary. A board member circled the block 3 times, pretending to be checking property lines. My mailbox was stuffed with 2 more violation notices claiming issues I knew didn't exist. And later in the day, I caught someone trying to photograph the inside of my garage through a crack in the door. They weren't being subtle anymore. They sensed resistance. They sensed danger. But the turning point arrived that evening. Just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I noticed Alden walking past my house. He didn't knock or speak, he simply paused at the end of my driveway, pretending to check his clipboard, but his eyes remained fixed on my windows. He looked too calm, too collected, the way someone looks when they believe they've already won. After a long minute, he walked away, but his smirk lingered like a warning. It was a reminder that he still believed he controlled this neighborhood. And that I was just another file he planned to remove. But what he didn't know was that someone else, someone within the neighborhood, had already sided with me. Late that night, my porch camera caught the same quiet neighbor who had given me the flash drive returning under cover of darkness. He stayed hidden near the bushes until the HOA patrol car passed, then slipped out and tapped on my door. His urgency was unmistakable. He handed me an envelope, unmarked, sealed, slightly crumpled, and whispered that things were happening faster than he expected. He said the HOA meeting scheduled for the next evening wasn't just a routine session, the board was planning to finalize my removal, claiming unspecified community disruption as justification. Even worse, they intended to make the vote a closed-door decision, bypassing the usual homeowner notification process. It wasn't just an eviction. It was a silencing. When he left, I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were printed screenshots, emails between board members discussing how they needed to remove the risk, prevent exposure, and handle the situation promptly. Though they never mentioned my name directly, the timing and context made it clear, the risk was me. For the first time since the harassment began, my fear transformed into something sharper. Determination. If they wanted a silent vote, I would force them into a public reckoning. I spent the rest of the night preparing. I backed up the flash drive to multiple locations. I printed copies of every incriminating file. I compiled a chronological report of Alden's unauthorized house entries, complete with timestamps and photos. I created folders labeled for homeowners, for authorities, and for emergency release. If anything happened to me, the truth would spread anyway. As the hours passed, I began to understand why no one had ever stood up to the HOA before. It wasn't just because they were strict. It was because they were organized, relentless, and unafraid to destroy anyone who threatened the system. The HOA's power wasn't built on rules, it was built on fear. But fear doesn't hold when someone has nothing left to lose. The following morning arrived cold and heavy, as if even the sky sensed what was coming. I walked through Maple Crest with a quiet purpose, heading toward the community center where the meeting would be held that evening. Several neighbors watched from their windows, concern etched on their faces. They already knew something was brewing, they had felt the tension, the surveillance, the sudden escalation. Some wanted me to fight, others feared I would make things worse. But everyone sensed the shift. Rumors began to spread by midday. People whispered about mysterious files. About the president acting strange. About the HOA preparing to do something drastic. For the first time, cracks showed in the community's silence. By the time night fell and the meeting began, a large crowd had gathered outside the community hall. Not just board members, but homeowners, people who rarely attended anything HOA related. Their presence changed the energy entirely. Instead of quiet compliance, there was murmuring unrest, a collective suspicion that something was deeply wrong. Inside, the board moved quickly, trying to rush through agenda items, clearly hoping to reach the secret vote before homeowners grew impatient. Alden presided over the meeting with forced composure, pretending everything was normal. But small details betrayed him, his tapping foot, his clenched jaw, the way he avoided looking directly toward the back where I stood holding a sealed folder. And then, just before they attempted to transition into their closed session, I stepped forward. Every pair of eyes shifted to me. Conversations dropped into complete silence. Even the board froze, sensing a moment they had no control over. I walked toward the center of the room, placed the folder on the table, and announced that I had evidence regarding the president's activities, evidence that the entire neighborhood deserved to see. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Board members exchanged panicked glances. Alden's facade finally cracked. He tried to interrupt, to shut me down, to claim I had no authority to speak. But it didn't matter anymore. Because the entire room was already turning toward me, not with fear, but with rising curiosity and anger. And that was the instant I knew. Everything was about to collapse for him. The room felt electric the moment the folder touched the board's table. What had started as a routine HOA meeting had transformed into a gathering pulled taut by suspicion and fear. Maple Crest residents, long conditioned to obey the board's authority without question, now stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting, almost hungry, for the truth to reveal itself. The atmosphere no longer belonged to the HOA. It belonged to the neighborhood. Alden stood rigid, gripping the edge of his podium with whitening knuckles. His mask of authority, so carefully maintained for years, showed the first visible fracture. He had always thrived on intimidation, letters, fines, threats, but this moment was something he had never prepared for. His power came from operating in the shadows, from silence and secrecy. But now, with the folder sitting before him like a lit fuse, the shadows were evaporating fast. The board shuffled nervously in their seats. Some avoided eye contact, others stared at the papers with a dread that revealed they knew more than they had ever admitted. The homeowners whispered among themselves, their murmurs rising despite attempts by a few board members to restore order. The meeting had slipped out of their grip. I stood in the center of the room, awareness sharpened by adrenaline but grounded by weeks of preparation. Every file, every photo, every time-stamped entry had led to this moment. I knew that once the truth left my hands, there would be no going back. Whatever happened next would reshape this community forever. The tension broke when a homeowner stepped forward from the crowd, a quiet, elderly woman who had lived in Maple Crest since the development's first phase. She moved slowly but deliberately, her gaze fixed not on the board, but on the folder. Without a word, she reached for it. The board members tried to intervene with frantic hand gestures, but the weight of the crowd held them still. She flipped it open with steady fingers and scanned the pages. Her face changed, first confusion, then disbelief, then a kind of exhausted sorrow. The room seemed to inhale at once when she lifted the folder for all to see, revealing the printed evidence within, photos of Alden entering vacant homes, lists of falsified payments, and footage showing him unlocking doors that should have remained untouched. Gasps rippled across the hall. Some homeowners covered their mouths. Others muttered angrily. The board flinched, realizing the magnitude of what had just become public. And Alden, for the first time since the beginning of his reign over Maple Crest, looked truly cornered. As the woman passed the folder around, more documents surfaced, this time from homeowners who had quietly saved their own suspicious encounters. A man revealed an unexplained repair charge he had been forced to pay. A couple displayed emails from the board threatening legal action over violations that had never occurred. One resident produced photos of Alden removing items from a home during a period when the owner was out of state. Piece by piece, the room became a courtroom, and every resident became part of the prosecution. The board scrambled to contain the situation, insisting they needed private review or closed procedures, but it was too late. The crowd had tasted the truth and no longer trusted the structures that claimed authority. The walls that had protected Alden for years were crumbling under the weight of collective outrage. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A neighbor from the back stepped forward with trembling hands. He held a small binder, the kind issued during annual HOA audits, except this one wasn't from the HOA office. It was a hidden duplicate audit he had been keeping quietly for over a year. He had worked on the HOA's internal review committee before mysteriously being removed without explanation. He had kept this record because something had felt wrong even then, and now his caution made sense. Inside the binder were discrepancies, dozens of them. Unapproved budget transfers. Missing funds. Maintenance expenses that never happened. Checks deposited into shell companies Alden controlled. It was a roadmap of corruption, and it left no room for interpretation. The homeowners' whispers rose into outrage. They demanded answers. They demanded accountability. They demanded the dissolution of the board, or at the very least, the immediate removal of Alden. Pressure shifted rapidly. Board members realized their silence could make them complicit. One of them attempted to distance themselves, claiming ignorance. Another stuttered to justify missing documents. A third simply put their head in their hands. Their unity shattered under the weight of the truth. Alden made one last desperate attempt to regain control. He straightened his stance, tried to summon his former authority, and prepared to declare that everything laid before the community was fabricated. But before he could even form the words, a homeowner stepped between him and the podium, placing a single printed page on the surface in front of him. It was a copy of the HOA's own rulebook, highlighted, bookmarked, and open to the section defining abuse of authority, ethical misconduct, and grounds for immediate removal of an officer. The meaning was unmistakable. Alden wasn't just powerless. He was now the one facing expulsion. The room erupted, not with chaos, but with clarity. Homeowners rallied together, taking back the very structure that had oppressed them. They demanded a vote right there, in the open, with full transparency. The board, shaken and overwhelmed, recognized they had no choice. A vote was called. One by one, hands rose, not timidly, but with conviction. Nearly every homeowner in the room voted for Alden's immediate removal and for a complete investigation into HOA operations. The decision was overwhelming, absolute, and irreversible. Alden's expression hollowed as he realized the empire he had built on. Fear had collapsed in minutes. He left the room flanked by residents who followed him not out of respect, but to ensure he didn't disappear before authorities arrived. The board was dissolved within the hour. A temporary committee of homeowners took over, with some of the quietest residents emerging as unexpected leaders. People who had lived in the shadows of HOA intimidation stepped forward for the first time in years. By the next morning, the neighborhood changed in a way that felt almost surreal. Homeowners stood outside chatting, something they had once avoided for fear of being seen. Kids rode bikes freely. The air felt lighter, as if the oppressive weight had finally lifted from Maple Crest. Throughout the day, several neighbors came by my house, offering thanks, apologies, and cautious hope. They admitted they had suspected something was wrong but had never felt brave enough to say anything. My home, once targeted as a threat, had now become a symbol of the community's turning point. The same neighbor who had given me the flash drive visited quietly, this time with relief instead of fear in his eyes. He told me the neighborhood finally felt like a place where people belonged again, not because of rules, but because of each other. When the dust settled, I returned to my living room, sitting in the same place where weeks earlier I had stared at evidence with dread. Now the fear was gone. The house felt like mine again, not because the HOA allowed it, but because the people who lived here had finally reclaimed their community. Maple Crest had been built on order, but it was saved by truth. And the truth would echo for years in every corner of the neighborhood.